Welcome to our session today on culturally informed applications of the low FODMAP diet with Yi Min Teo. I'm Jocelyn Wells. I'm our registered dietitian here at FODZyme, where we make a digestive enzyme specifically designed to break down the FODMAPs, fructan, GOS, and lactose. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy to introduce herself and Yi Min.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Scott, and I manage our RD provider relationships over at Modify Health. And for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure of working with yet, we're a healthcare company. We specialize in medically tailored meal delivery services. We have low FODMAP meals, Mediterranean, heart healthy, carb conscious, diabetes friendly meal options for your patients to choose from. And all of our meals are gluten-free, and they're filterable by some other major dietary allergens like dairy, soy, etc. And we really appreciate our RD community. So many of our referrals, our provider referrals come for you. So thank you so much. And I'm so excited to be co-hosting this webinar. And I would love to introduce our wonderful speaker, Yi Min Teo. A little bit of quick background on her. Yi Min is a Los Angeles-based RDN and a certified nutrition support clinician. She owns Herbs and Food, which is a virtual, culturally inclusive digestive healthcare practice specializing in IBD, IBS, functional GI disorders, ostomy nutrition, tube feeding, IV nutrition. And I love her mission. She really aims to empower individuals of diverse cultural backgrounds to achieve peace and freedom from gut symptoms while rebuilding their relationship with food and culture. I had a little preview of this presentation. It's awesome. I think you guys are going to really enjoy. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Yi Min.
Thank you, Tracy, for that awesome introduction. I'm very honored and humbled to be here to be sharing a little bit about what I'm passionate about. And really with this whole area of cultural nutrition, there's always, a lack of information or just a lot of nuances that can be challenging to navigate. So hopefully today I can share a little bit of insights and also some patient stories that really have contributed to the happening of this presentation. We'll be talking about culturally informed applications of the low FODMAP diet. If you have any questions or thoughts, I would love to hear them as well. And so drop them in the comments section or Q&A section. So for the learning objectives today, I'm hoping that you can have some main takeaways when it comes to evaluating nutrition assessments for someone from a culturally diverse background, describing the cultural values, beliefs, and attitudes, and how they can impact on really following any kind of dietary modification or restriction, applying culturally responsive principles to help improve communication and build rapport with patients of diverse cultural backgrounds, and ultimately using those information to help develop a plan together with your patients to help increase adherence to behaviors that can improve GI symptoms when working with patients of various cultural backgrounds. So I wanted to start off with this question just to paint a picture for you guys. If you're on your way to see a provider who has a vastly different cultural background than you, what are some thoughts, feelings, or emotions that come to mind? Let's say if you're looking for a new PCP, if you're looking for a new gastroenterologist or dietitian, do you have any potentially some hesitation or some questions that you have for that provider? What are you looking for when it comes to deciding how to what kind of care you want? And I think this is something that is important to keep in mind. It's easy to reflect that for ourselves, but when it comes to you being the dietitian, being that nutrition expert in the room and facilitating that conversation with your patient, it could look a little bit different. And so I'll go through some of the pointers that might be helpful to maybe make it a little bit easier, more comfortable for your patients and yourself. So really, you cannot talk about food without talking about all these different factors. Food is intricately related to our beliefs, our value system, our identity, food identity, or culture identity. And with what's going on in the world right now, that also has a huge impact on food access, food security. So war, conflict, displacement, that impacts food access. For individuals who come from different countries, there is this degree of acculturation that has to be considered when it comes to nutrition recommendations, or that really influence what they eat. And there's this increasing amount of discussion with regards to someone who is a third culture kid, where their parents, like maybe dad is from England and mom is from Pakistan, and the kid grew up in the US. And so you have various influences from different cultures and different countries. Cultural values, religious beliefs, and practices can also really spearhead and gear the food decision-making process. So if someone is a Buddhist, they're gonna more or less follow a vegetarian diet to various degrees. For our Muslim friends who needs to fast during Ramadan, your nutrition considerations during that period will look a little bit different as well. Medicinal properties in traditional medicine, that's very common in different cultures in different ways. So personally, I'm Singaporean, and a lot of the foods and ingredients that I grew up eating is not just, we don't just talk about calories and protein and fiber, which we all are really good at calculating as dietitians, but what is the healing properties of that food item? And that is also a huge consideration when we think about what we want to add or potentially limit in our diet. Societal norms, definitions of health and body image, that is definitely a huge thing. Just a simple kind of story that's also really common for kids, growing up. If you are of a different cultural background and you're growing up in the States, you bring your cultural foods to school, being super excited, wanting to eat it, but you might have friends who have different views about what the food that you bring to the table. And so that can really affect your decision making, not really from a nutrient standpoint of how nourishing the food is, but really, perception from others that you're considering. Built environment, food access, and affordability is a huge factor when it comes to decision making as well, deciding what to eat. Or at that point, it's more of what options do you have? If you're living in a food desert and you are trying to implement the low FODMAP diet, it could be pretty challenging because you only have access to certain foods in that specific area. You probably have to travel a really long distance to get to a grocery store that have limited options. Food brings people together, and I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with that, and that's what we use to connect, with our friends and family over community meals, family meals, hang out with friends at a new restaurant, getting new experiences. And so when we talk about food and dietary modifications, we have to take all these factors into consideration, because any changes in the food items that we eat will impact these values potentially in various magnitudes. So this is kind of a flow chart reflecting more of the acculturative differences and how it impacts nutrition intake in individuals who are immigrating to a different country. A lot of it I've discussed in the previous slides, but you can see at the very end, when you look at patterns of dietary intake, there's so much buildup from other different factors, like your socioeconomic factors, cultural factors. When you have exposure to in a different country, in a different setting, not just culturally, but maybe within the community, there is changes when it comes to taste preferences or psychosocial factors, environmental factors that is going to lead to the final decision of like, okay, this is how my diet's looking like day to day, not because I decided to make that change yesterday or the day before. It's more of that evolving pattern over years or months, depending on what the individual is exposed to. And so food is intricately linked with cultural identity, emotional and mental health, as long as that personal values of that person. So when we tell people that their food is bad, or certain ingredients that they commonly use is bad, inherently the message that they're getting is that, oh, I'm not doing a good job. I am not following the right diet. And what they believe to be healthy, to be nourishing, to be good will likely be challenged in those situations, and individuals tend to not feel safe. And that's something that we don't really want to promote, create during a nutrition counseling session when we're talking about making lifestyle changes. You're essentially supporting them to change certain aspects of their life. So you really want to be careful, non-judgmental, and offer that neutral and safe space. So just a plug for all of us artists of color out here doing the work. The most important thing is to be able to aim for to provide culturally inclusive, responsive, and safe nutrition care. Words have power, so we need to be mindful of what words we're using, how we're phrasing things or not. Trust, rapport, and communication takes time to build. You likely will not get there 100% with your clients or patients in one single nutrition session. So just something to keep in mind. You might not get the full information, and it's okay to work with what is being shared and what that individual is comfortable with at that moment. And it's almost like you have to prove yourself a little bit, allowing yourself to have that conversation, allowing the clients and patients themselves to share their story, right? It's kind of their life story and their life experiences. And so I've kind of listed some of the main things down here that we should keep in mind in our practice is that trauma-informed care, and understanding that what that means is really important. Evidence-based medical nutrition therapy is really the key to what we all do as dietitians, but also understanding there might be some nuances when you're talking about, let's say, traditional Chinese medicine or Eastern medicine influences or cultural norms that may not be in the medical literature. And so knowing how to navigate that in a gentle way, neutral way, is really going to help facilitate the conversation and bridge that gap so your patients are more willing to share. Ultimately, it's a lot of internal work on us as healthcare professionals, being able to self-check biases, prejudice, and stereotypes that we have, understanding that what an individual goes through from a specific ethnicity, race, or cultural background it's likely not the same compared to someone else of similar background. So the biggest question ever, and probably we're all familiar with this, all patients are going to ask us, I'm really struggling with my GI symptoms, but what can I eat or not to get rid of it? And there's a lot of questions around, at least in my practice, I do see mostly patients, clients of color. And so there's always these questions of like, I don't see my cultural food on that food list that was given to me by another provider. Can I still eat them? I'm not quite sure. And there's a lot of stress and anxiety and that feeling of unknown surrounding what they're most familiar with, their comfort food, their cultural foods, something that they lean on during especially stressful times, and now it's being questioned. And so that is an area where we can allow patients to share a bit more of their story and not just cutting them off, especially during nutrition assessment sessions. So just to switch gear a little bit, we'll talk a bit about low FODMAP diet and how we can use that as a tool to kind of help our patients to manage their GI symptoms. Typically, as we all know, it's used mainly for IBS patients to help with symptomatic relief. We see really good results with it. In IBD patients, which is Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, for IBD patients in remission, a low FODMAP diet can be used to help patients achieve symptomatic relief if the FODMAPs are actually the triggers in this specific situations. It doesn't necessarily reduce the flares or reduce that inflammation, but we see that symptomatic relief that is beneficial for our patients. For individuals with celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, similar situation. If they're on a gluten-free diet and are still experiencing symptoms, then some FODMAP modification could be helpful if that's actually a trigger for the patient. For other patients that don't fall into these buckets, if they have made dietary modifications and they don't see improvements in their symptoms, and they do have ongoing GI workups and most major conditions are ruled out, low FODMAP diet could potentially be a way to help identify potential food triggers. So just an overview of what FODMAPs are. I've listed the main ones down here. And really, this is helpful to kind of look at when it comes to reviewing ingredients lists in different products, or as talking points when you're looking at different foods that might not be on the FODMAP food list with your clients. And so I'm going to go through more about that in the next slides. Some of the main points that I personally have found helpful when it comes to navigating that unknown territory with, different cultural foods that don't have much data, that we don't have much data on, is that understanding FODMAPs are water soluble. So when it comes to looking at culinary considerations of how that dish is being cooked or being prepared, this is a really great way to, as we know, that if we cook, blanch, soak, can certain food items, that will help leach out the FODMAPs and make it more tolerable, or our patients could have it in larger servings. And so just utilizing and leaning on these principles versus just specific grams or specific percentage of numbers of certain FODMAPs that might be available for certain more common foods. Also, understanding low FODMAP diet is a 3-step process. It is the elimination process, could be anywhere. I've seen 2 to 6 weeks, up to the dietitian's discretion and discussion with your patient. The second and third phase is reintroduction and integration. And I think a lot of individuals or patients, before they come to me, for example, they're typically already doing that elimination diet in some form or another. But there is no discussion or lack of understanding of reintroducing foods in a more of a proper way, so that you can identify potential food triggers in that sense. And so for someone who is on the elimination phase for a long period of time, there is that risk for nutrient deficiency in the long run. And so when we're looking at implementing a low FODMAP diet cross-culturally, just with the data that's out there, and some of the on-the-ground challenges that's being faced with some of these research that's being done, especially in Asia, a lot of the good data are coming out of Asia, which I'm super excited about, because then they're looking into food composition, they're looking into challenges with adhering to the diet. It might be very different than what we are used to seeing in the US potentially. And so far, some of the things that have been brought up is that limited knowledge of FODMAP contents of local diet, making it really hard to kind of decide, oh, is this ingredient appropriate? Can we actually use it in, the elimination phase? We don't know. So there is some challenges there. Malnutrition may also worsen with FODMAP restriction. And so the knowledge or the lack of this potential issue could make it challenging to implement a diet as well. In different countries, there's different labeling rules. So if there is packaged food ingredients that someone has in their pantry, and their labels are not really clear of like the amounts of ingredients that's in there, it could also be challenging for potentially you to figure out the FODMAP content in those items. Low FODMAP alternative foods, I'm excited to see more and more coming up, especially that's available in the US, but there's not that much available in other countries, especially Asia, given that IBS is still kind of an evolving condition in that area. And typically when you are trying to use this low FODMAP alternatives as a patient, very often, like I said, just like that kid that's in the cafeteria with other friends around them, there is that fear or that concern with social acceptance, because you're eating something different, you're eating something that other people are not familiar with. Some of these foods can be expensive, and so as we look at low FODMAP alternatives, that might make it less feasible for someone to implement it. The lack of dietetic expertise, and I think I'm more so referring this to kind of that gap that I was mentioning earlier, when we don't have as much knowledge of various cultural backgrounds, and how do we kind of bridge that gap for our patients to really be able to disseminate the information of the low FODMAP diet more effectively to them. For certain individuals, limited English and or health literacy can make it a challenge. Low FODMAP diets are complicated. When I was learning about it myself initially, I was very confused, and different websites gives you different numbers, different portions, and the FODMAP content updates often in the Monash app. And so if I'm having that potential challenge myself, it could be similar for my patients and my clients. So having that understanding, which means that potentially you might need to do a little bit more legwork with your clients to make the implementation a little bit more smoother. So before we go into the application part of the low FODMAP diet, or things to kind of think about in your assessments or intervention, I just wanted to put these two definitions up here because I think it's important to carry that into really any sessions that you have with your patients and your clients. Like I've mentioned before, creating that non-judgmental safe space where clients and patients are able to share their story, share what they are eating, because very often there could be a lot of shame, stress, and anxiety around their food choices, and they might not be comfortable with sharing about that with you yet. And so our body language, our words are going to matter a lot in this situation. And so be genuinely curious, practice cultural humility, open up conversations in a way that you're genuinely interested and asking them about, their life, their stories, and giving them the opportunity to share about it. And so my rule of thumb for myself is if I'm talking too much in a session, I'm probably not listening enough to my patients and clients to get that information. And so information about race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender, sexual orientation, education, social needs, etc., will come up as they share more about their food, especially in different cultures, because many cultures are community-based. And so a lot of the food decisions is not necessarily based on what I want, what I eat, what I like. It's also about, oh, this is typically traditionally how my family eats, and this is what my mom always makes. So to change that could potentially affect, the family dynamics or relationship. And that's something you won't really know until you are allowing your patients and the clients to share their story. And so cultural responsiveness is also important because at that point as we open up that conversation, we also need to recognize potential biases that we have and understand that our culture and the individual's culture is different, and how to respect that boundaries and being open to what the individual is sharing. And your job as a dietitian is to really identify patterns and support your patients on their journey, depending on what they're ready for to change or not. And so when it comes to nutrition assessment, you're now trying to get information of, how should I proceed with my recommendations? What recommendations are appropriate, safe, and what could be left for a later time? And so I typically start with, share with me about a day in your life. How does that look like? What time do you usually wake up? What do you usually have for breakfast? Do you eat breakfast? How do you decide what foods you have for breakfast, or the meal prep process? And in that situations, you're asking a lot of open-ended questions and allowing the individual to share. So it's also, utilizing motivational interviewing principles as well. Do not assume that individuals of the same ethnicity and race eat the same food or have the same life experiences. A lot of people with, potentially, if I'm Singaporean, I'm Asian, I'm Chinese, another Singaporean Chinese is probably not going to eat the same way as I do. And so allow the individual to share their story and let that guide the conversation versus you being in control of that conversations and having fixed questions that you need to ask. Acknowledging what's happening in the world outside of the nutrition session, because we all know when we have stressors in our lives, when we have changes in our life, significant life events, that can affect our appetite, that can affect what we eat and our food choices. Maybe it's a time where someone's having more comfort food in this day in their life, right? And so having them share that with you over time would be helpful as well. When appropriate, explore family food preferences, dynamics, and cultural and religious practices. like I've mentioned earlier, when it comes to cultural practices and religion, family meals and how families decide to go about it, that could be very private and very sacred for an individual, and that can vary across different cultures. And so prompting questions can be helpful, but if you notice someone's body language and they're not really open to sharing it right now, it's okay to take a pause and come back later. You do not have to get all the information all at once. Respect your patient's comfort level, and that way it's another step to help you build that trust and rapport over time. Assessment tips: go beyond macros. We're very good at calculations. We're very good at determining if someone's eating enough of certain nutrients or not. And ultimately, I do want to know more about that decision behind why that individual chose that specific food. So very often, food photos, food logs, diet recalls are all really helpful to help piece the puzzle pieces together. I'm showing 2 photos that my clients and patients have sent me, where you can see the first top photo is sam. It's more of a Korean, lettuce wrap with meat in it. You have different side dishes we call banchan. And so in this specific situations, I personally want to explore more about how they feel around this meal, why they made this decision, and kind of go from there. And evaluating FODMAP content could be challenging in this situation because we don't really know. This is a shareable portion, and so that is more of a conversation that will evolve as you chat with your patients and clients. Beverage, supplements, herbal medicines taken orally all count. Depending on what kind of ingredients that's being added. There's a lot of individuals that love smoothies. I love smoothies myself. And so those will all matter when you're evaluating FODMAP content and any correlations or patterns with GI symptoms. For patients of culturally diverse backgrounds, they might be, commonly consuming dishes that you're not familiar with, and that's totally okay. It's okay to Google a lot of these things and learn about it. So personally, to learn more about the other cultures of my clients and patients, I always encourage them to write the dish of that name down, not just writing the English version of it, because sometimes that doesn't really convey the whole meaning or the whole, I almost call it identity of that dish. That way for me on my end, when I look it up online, when I read about the history and the stories associated with that dish, it gives me a better perspective, and it's easier to gather data as well. Any ingredients that is incorporated into huge mixed meals that's common in different cultures, if it's made from scratch, could be helpful because you are trying to decipher and sift through and see if there's any particular ingredients that's being used in large amounts that could be causing issues. Ask about cooking methods. How do you make your rice? How do you make this curry stew? Do you blanch your beans? Do you boil them? Do you soak them? In various cultures, these practices might already be in place, and it's just part of how the recipe works. And so if that's already the case, your clients might potentially already be unintentionally reducing FODMAPs in their food. And so be curious and ask about that. There's a little bit more effort in that sense, but it could be helpful in the long run when you're trying to determine if a low FODMAP diet is feasible or not. I've briefly mentioned about serving sizes. So if an individual is always having family meals where they're eating with 8 family members and they have 10 dishes on the table, it's really hard to determine what is causing symptoms or not, depending on the portions, versus individual servings, there's a lot more control over it. But then again, another realm of discussion that you can have with your patients and clients. Food prep, also kind of mentioned this before, if it's something that's done by the family members or the individuals themselves, this would affect the amount of control that individual have on meal modifications. If an individual is cooking for family versus individual servings, that can affect that as well. Social settings and obligations is definitely more of a nuanced conversation. Potentially that might be the deal breaker for implementing any kind of dietary restriction or modification for the individual. So if someone's are always having family meals, and there's always gatherings and meetups with elders or different with your community members, and there is pressure to always quote unquote eat more, and at least that's really common in the Chinese culture, and making sure you clean your plate instead of stop eating when you're feeling full and satisfied. So that might also be contributing to symptoms. So that's a really helpful tip to look at and explore. And while you attempt to identify patterns between GI symptoms and the food that they are eating itself, also take note of stressful life events and changes throughout their life, or even not just for that day itself, also including the stress that happens when it comes to making food decisions or making food modifications. That also might be a consideration on your end when you're evaluating the feasibility of implementing a low FODMAP diet. So I'm going to share a little bit about the different foods that's available in various cultures. These are not comprehensive by any means. I'm sharing also a lot of the foods that I grew up eating that I'm familiar with, and some of them Google is my best friend. And so that's kind of how I over time have learned on navigating the FODMAP contents and how much there is in different food items. So these are just some common ones that is common in Asia. With starches, we have flavored rice cakes, barley, roti and naan, wheat noodles. Rice cakes themselves are gluten-free, low FODMAP, but very often as part of sweets and confectionaries, there's a lot of seasoning that's added, and that can make it high FODMAP. For veggies, we have split peas, bitter gourd. Bitter gourd typically has as a healing property, a cooling property in Chinese medicine, but that could be high FODMAP and might not be ideal for someone who's struggling with symptoms when you're having that conversation about traditional, healing properties of traditional Chinese medicine. In Asia, there's a lot of evaporated milk, sweetened condensed milk that's being added to coffee and teas in the morning. So just keep that in mind as you are getting your dietary recall. Encourage patients to really write down, ingredients if they know about it. If not, if that coffee looks a little different than black coffee, it might be worth asking about it or looking it up on what form is being commonly consumed in that culture. Some of the fermented foods can be high FODMAP, yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut to some degree. So opting for lactose-free options would be helpful in this case as a substitute. Wasabi paste, surprisingly, is high FODMAP. I don't think anyone's really going to eat a lot of wasabi paste, but just something to keep in mind, they do have additives and stabilizers in them that can contribute to the FODMAP content. And with functional foods, I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar. We're seeing a lot of them on the market, not just in the US, across the globe. There obviously a lot of patients would be bringing those items and asking you, hey, can I have this, without really having a knowledge of the ingredients that's being used. They might just be focusing on, oh, there's a lot of fiber in this sweet, in this candy, but not realizing there is 13 grams of fiber in it. And so something to evaluate and keep in mind, and having them share that as well. So with the high FODMAP foods taken care of, we have the low FODMAP items. And surprisingly, in my personal experience, when I evaluate dietary recalls that's provided from my patients, if they're having more of a cultural diet, very often they're already low FODMAP with at least the main major ingredients. And so you can see that there's some of these really common starches and grains that's incorporated into their meals or the main part of their meals. As an Asian, rice is life. So rice is low FODMAP, which is great. I don't have to necessarily remove that from my diet. Fruits and vegetables, there's a lot of tropical fruits and vegetables that are low FODMAP, and also associated with a lot of healing properties in traditional medicines. And so this is just a good list to kind of refer to if your patients bring them up. For protein, in general, animal proteins will be low in FODMAPs unless there's additional ingredients that's added during processing. For plant-based options, tofu skins, firm tofu, tempeh, fermented soy products, if none of the high FODMAP ingredients are added, could be really good protein sources as well. Certain nuts, legumes, making sure that they're canned and drained, that will be really helpful in removing those FODMAPs if your patient is not really willing to give up the staple, with it being lentils. I've mentioned about the yogurts, hard cheeses if it's common in their culture instead of soft cheeses. For mushrooms, very common in Asian cuisines, offering that low FODMAP substitute, which is oyster mushrooms or wood ear mushrooms instead of shiitake, which can be higher in FODMAPs. Biggest questions that I get from patients is that, can I still use the spices that is traditional in my cuisine? Without these spices, it just does not taste the same, and then I don't want to eat it. Fortunately, most spice powders are safe at 1 teaspoon per spice. And usually when you're incorporating so many different spices, you're making a pretty big dish. And so considering the total amount of spice used in that mixed dish, and how many servings of that dish that it's going to give you. If you're making a pot of curry and you're using 6 to 7 different spices, it's 6 to 7 teaspoons worth of spices, but you might be eating that over 8 meals. And so the FODMAP content associated with the portions are going to go way down when it's evenly distributed in that sense. So some of the common spices that are low FODMAP I've kind of listed them here. Very often how in different tradition and cultures, there's a lot of infused oils already, where in the Chinese culture, we have cong you mian, or scallion oil noodles, where you are infusing the green onions with the oil, or vice versa, and then mixing it with noodles. And so it's already part of the culture and it's very common. So at that point, it's more of just telling patients and clients like, oh, maybe not eating the green onions themselves, the green parts are fine, but it's really the oil that will give you the aroma, and that is okay to have. A lot of these spices in terms of culinary use and processes in recipes, you are blooming them. And so you're having hot oil in the pan and you're adding all these spices, and with that interaction during cooking, that brings out the aroma. And so instead of adding spices into boiling water and just doing like a 1-pot meal, potentially stir frying a little bit of those spice mix could bring out a lot more flavor. So that's one way that I discuss with my patients and clients when you're trying to really maintain the integrity of the recipe and that flavor that you remember. With sauces, it really varies widely between brands. I personally have seen soy sauce having different ingredients and, fillers, emulsifiers, things like that, across different brands. And so at that point, it's more about, oh, do you have a specific brand you use? Let's look at the ingredients list together. But in general, soy sauce, kacang manis, which is sweet soy sauce, chimichurri fish sauce in moderate amounts is considered low FODMAP that they can incorporate in their meals. So I call them FODMAP wildcards because you really don't know, and you really have to look at the ingredients list and the nutrition label to figure it out. And at this point, it's also the discussion with your patients on the comfort level with navigating that, because that's going to be kind of the starting point on figuring out if this is something that could be low FODMAP. For kimchi specifically, very commonly, garlic and onion is added as part of the fermentation process and flavoring. The amounts, it's really hard to tell from the packaging, but depending on what your FODMAP triggers are, the amounts that's being added to that whole bottle of kimchi might be a lot less significant, or it might be not as triggering, depending on that individual's degree of symptoms. There are kimchis that do not have garlic and onion, but I can tell they don't taste the same. So you can offer substitutes and you can see how your clients and patients feel about it, but let them have that liberty to decide and choose and explore, right? So it's not a black and white situation. gochujang, which is red pepper paste, Korean red pepper skipping my words, red pepper paste. Sometimes that could also have garlic and onion in there, depending on the brand. Curry paste or rempa in Malay typically will have those FODMAPs as well as sambal chili sauces. With pickled garlic and onions, I've looked at it on the Monash diet app. Some of them are actually low FODMAP in really small amounts. And so if that is a non-negotiable for your patients or your clients, that could still be an option. So looking it up on my own to learn more about why pickled garlic and onions could work is that the FODMAP, like I said, is water soluble, and that can leach into the pickle brine, and that can reduce the FODMAPs by about 80%. That being said, proceed with caution because different brands process the things differently, especially when it comes to international packaged foods and mixed dishes, because labeling rules are a little bit different. I have found products that have a really short ingredient list, which I was super excited about. Then when I started cooking it, I realized this doesn't feel right. I think there's more ingredients that's added and during the processing part of it. And so proceed at your own risk in these situations. Just have that conversations on kind of the game plan and what to look out for with your patients and clients. So developing a low FODMAP plan together, it shouldn't be you telling your patient and client, like, you should stop eating garlic, you should stop eating onions, you should stop having curry, you should, avoid this and that. You are going to shut people off and they will not be interested. There is a way to navigate that, but both parties have to be on board, and there'll be a lot of nuanced discussion in that to figure out what is appropriate and what people are comfortable with. The ability to read nutrition labels, estimating portion sizes, or using tools can be really helpful. Sometimes if that's a huge challenge and they're not comfortable with that, we have to respect that. And so navigating that low FODMAP period and having actual the anticipated degree of symptom improvement might not be as well as what we expect to. Explore substitutes, like I've mentioned before, or a half and half situation. If an individual is using 10 cloves of garlic in this mixed dish, and that's potentially a FODMAP trigger, can we do less of it? And then substituting with another aromatic or garlic infused oils to still have a bit of that flavor if they don't want to give garlic cloves up. I've mentioned respecting clients' non-negotiables, meeting them where they are. Not everyone's going to be on board with the low FODMAP plan immediately right now, maybe later, depending on what's going on in their lives. And so you as a dietitian need to pull the brakes when as necessary. If you personally are not comfortable with this whole discussion and nuances and consideration with your clients and patients, it's totally okay to refer out. There's a lot of dietitians with very diverse cultural backgrounds that's doing really cool work in the GI space as well. So definitely, it's okay to refer patients out. When it comes to assessment, because of such a restrictive nature of the low FODMAP diet, very often that potentially might not be the first thing I personally jump to, unless there's a very clear indication and the patient's at a really low nutrition risk. It's probably not appropriate if there are concerns for malnutrition, eating disorders, or any conditions that put them at a high risk for nutrient deficiency. If they're not ready for a change at this point, that's okay. There's always other modifications and strategies that you can implement and suggest. Financial barriers, if someone feels like that is a lot of legwork and they might not be also able to pull out that money right now to try out this diet, then that is a valid reason to not pursue it. So in those situations, how can we support our patients to get symptomatic relief? There are non-diet strategies as well, and these are just some of the common ones that we're seeing that's evidence-based that can help provide significant improvements from the literature. Peppermint oil, probiotics, specific strains depending on the condition, digestive enzymes like FODZyme, gut-directed hypnotherapy. Nerva is one that's out there. There's also a couple that's coming up as well. Gentle FODMAP diet could be helpful when you're just limiting really high FODMAP foods, and from the diet recall, it's pretty evident that that's really the cause of the trigger. Beyond the literature, where we really don't have much data on, but there is more emerging discussions and case studies about it, is traditional and native medicine. There are a lot of herbs, tinctures that are utilized to help improve GI symptoms that's independent of nutrient adequacy or calories and proteins and things like that. And some patients might want to pursue that. And as your role, very often we don't know much about that, and it's really common to just say, oh, I'm not sure, go check in with your doctor. I think very often what I would say to my patients is that just be aware of any safety concerns when it comes to using herbs that are at really high amounts, right? Because we are also considering, liver and kidney health in these situations. So really empowering your patients with that information and having them make that informed decisions for themselves with your support. It's going to make it a lot easier. It's going to probably help decrease a lot of the stress and anxiety that they're experiencing, which probably are also contributing to their GI symptoms. And so just to wrap everything up, that was a lot of information. It's definitely not conclusive, because there's a lot more to learn about different cultures, different lived experiences, and how that can impact how an individual eat. And so hopefully this presentation is able to give you some insights and some thinking points when you're going into your next session prior to suggesting dietary modifications. We do not have to recommend low FODMAP diet off the bat. It is useful as a tool at the right time, at the right place. Definitely screen and assess for feasibility before suggesting to implement the low FODMAP diet. If someone's at a high risk for malnutrition and eating disorders, those are things that should be addressed before embarking on the low FODMAP diet restriction, because there's often other factors like those two issues where it's probably exacerbating the GI symptoms as well. Practice cultural humility, stay curious, open-minded, and non-judgmental to create safe space for patients and clients to share about themselves, to share their stories. You're not going to get there on day one. It's going to take time, and that is okay. Non-diet strategies may be more appropriate than dietary restrictions for certain patients and clients. There are supplements, medications, and other forms of therapies that could be used to help facilitate to alleviate the GI symptoms, and that might be more appropriate than food restrictions at this point. So I just want to provide some resources as a starting point that I found helpful for myself as I navigate through these nuances with my clients. But the Monash Food app and website, it's great. The app they're always adding new foods, and there have been more studies that is done in Asia, where they're asking patients on what foods they commonly eat that they want to know about when it comes to FODMAP content. And so those foods are gradually being added to the database, which is definitely helpful for us as providers. I've realized Fig app is also really helpful. FODMAP Everyday goes into the rationale and details of how each FODMAP works, and how any kind of like culinary methods that can be helpful with reducing them to make it more accessible for your patients. There's more low FODMAP diet research studies that's coming up for specific regions. Definitely super exciting, more to come on that. Definitely over the past 2 to 3 years, I've seen a little bit more information on those that we can leverage. Food science studies are also really helpful if we're wanting to geek out about it, nerd out about it. For example, with tofu skin, personally, there is no data on FODMAPs on it, right? And so looking into the composition of tofu skin and kind of almost guessing if this is something that would be low FODMAP versus not, and doing a FODMAP challenge with that item with my patient, because that is something that my patient really wanted and do not want to give them. That's a source of really good protein too for her. Patient perspectives and food tips, that's really where a lot of ideas and inspiration I get, and that brings me down a whole different rabbit hole. very often lived experiences are as valuable as our nutrition expertise. And so social media discussion boards, surprisingly Reddit, where people are sharing about their experiences on navigating the low FODMAP diet while they're traveling to a different country, and what resources available in that specific location. Connect with fellow artists of color. I'm more than happy to chat with anybody who's interested in this to better bridge that gap for our patients. There's also GI Professionals Directory with these organizations for dietitians who specialize in IBS or for other GI conditions. I mentioned in the first couple slides on, checking our own biases and assumptions and stereotypes that we have for others. There is this implicit association test that you could take to kind of assess that for yourself. It is out of Harvard, I believe. And so I do have a link for that in the notes section. So if that's something you're interested in, you can explore that as well. Or almost at the end. Cultural food resources. These are some of the studies, like I said, that have come up over the past couple of years that talks about low FODMAP options and some of the cultural barriers and challenges that they face when it comes to implementing it in different countries. So highly, highly recommend for you to read these articles. Very long articles with really good qualitative information that you can utilize in your practice. And here are my references. And thank you so much for your attention and your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yi Min. That was truly a wonderful presentation. We have some amazing, amazing questions here. Just to also address some of the questions that I see coming up in the chat as well. So we'll not be sharing the slides to this, but you will receive a link to the recording. So you can review and flip through and pause anytime so that you can reference any of the amazing material that we have in here. I'll also, when I send the recording, share a link to the implicit association test so that you all have that easily accessible as well. And now to get started with our questions. So let's start here with a question from Cheryl asking, is IBS high in Asia like in the US? I think I saw another question along these lines. So if you have any knowledge on the prevalence, we'd love to hear it. You're on mute.
Sorry. The rates of IBS in various Asian countries are actually pretty similar to the US, maybe slightly lower, but then there's also this question about, time to diagnosis or misdiagnosis and things like that. And very often with GI symptoms and struggles, there is this cultural stigma that individuals are not, they don't feel safe or they're not willing to share or talk about it. And so it could be higher, it could be lower, we're not sure. But for individuals who are willing to talk about it, we have to make sure that there are resources that's out there for them.
Thank you. Yes, so many challenges. Here we have another question. I know you alluded to this a little bit, but what type of cooking methods reduce FODMAPs? Maybe beyond also kind of the boiling or leaching that you mentioned, some strategies like blooming spices, if there's anything more in that category to get the most out of our cooking methods and techniques to help patients.
Yeah, I think this is very depending on the type of recipes that individuals make. I think the ones that I've mentioned are kind of the common themes that I've seen when it comes to extracting flavors, maintaining more of the integrity of the recipe themselves. I think it's a hard balance. And at that point, it's also kind of the patients themselves have to make that decision of like, okay, well, do I want like 100% flavor with really high FODMAPs, or do I want, half the flavor and I can still enjoy this dish more regularly without GI issues, or just have the whole shebang but less frequently, right? And so cooking methods is just one aspect of it, like the blooming of the spices to bring out the aromatics. But currently with the boiling, blanching, canned and drained cooking methods, that has been shown to be the most effective. And so just carrying that into the consideration when it comes to preparing, like, you could boil and blanch your high FODMAP vegetables potentially to help decrease that content. And so I think that's where I would just kind of stick with and see what comes out of that. instead of bombarding that individual with like a ton more different cooking methods, because depending on the individual's cooking skills too, it might not be something that would be relevant.
Thank you. Here we have another question from Daisy, and this came in during the kind of discussion on some of the spices and different sauces that may or may not be low FODMAP. So really trying to piece out, which FODMAP they might be high in. So if you could share any kind of reference to, not just what is high or low FODMAP, where they can maybe help patients look to see what specific FODMAP it may be high or low in. Do you have any advice there?
Yeah, that is usually a challenge on my end for sure, especially with different kinds of sauces. What I've done before on my own and also with clients is that I would say, hey, let's look at this satay sauce together. Like, let's look at the ingredients list together. And typically with the ingredients, the raw ingredients that is included in the sauce making process, it's typically listed in a lot of the food database that's out there already. So the sauce itself might not be, but the ingredients can be. And so you want to see how much of that sauce are you actually using, and then looking at how much of the ingredients are, higher in specific FODMAPs. And so there are so many sauces out there. I don't know if I can really talk about each specific ingredients and FODMAPs, but there's definitely a lot more Googling involved and putting that into context. So if your sauce has 2 or 3 really high FODMAP ingredients, depending on where you are in that, if you're in the elimination phase, is it okay for you to just hold off on that for a little bit, or have it less frequently in smaller amounts? If you're in the reintroduction phase, that item on its own could be used as the FODMAP challenge, right? So I think not the best answer. I have more questions than answers in the situations, but definitely exploring the different ingredients and having those guide you with this process.
Yeah. Here we have a question from Doris. When it says that most spice powders are safe at 1 teaspoon, is that 1 teaspoon per meal or per day?
It would be, your FODMAP load is per meal versus per day. And so if you have a moderate low FODMAP meal, typically after a couple hours, if you're having the same meal again or a meal with different FODMAP content, that is considered separate.
Yeah. Here from Nancy, a question: are you saying the incidental ingredients on international foods may be present but not listed on the ingredient list?
Potentially. I've seen that in some of the products in Asia. Then again, each country's label regulation rules are a little bit different. And so even in the US, there's also variability, right? So if we don't know exactly how much of the ingredient is in the food, there is some leeway allowed. And so I would say use that as a guide versus specific grams themselves. It could be a little bit hard. And so in those situations, depending on the patient, it might be easier to just hold off on it for a little bit and utilize that as part of reintroduction, potentially.
Thank you. Here we have a few questions on gut-directed hypnotherapy. So maybe you could share how you approach this in your sessions or give an example of how to incorporate that.
Yeah, I always ask my patients if they're already seeing a therapist. If not, it probably is a good idea, especially if they're going through a lot of stressful times and needing someone to walk them through that process. If someone's really struggling with, stress, anxiety, and thinking about low FODMAP diet implementation is going to worsen it, I probably wouldn't go that route. Gut-directed hypnotherapy can also help with symptoms that's independent of, dietary changes, and that might be more appropriate, more gentle as an option versus diet therapy in this case. And so, typically in sessions, if that is more apparent, it's becoming apparent to me that the stress management aspect is, taking over as more of a priority, then I might suggest to say like, hey, have you considered talking to a therapist to see if gut-directed immunotherapy could be appropriate. Because I think at this point, it seems like implementing any kind of dietary changes might give you a lot more stress, and it might not be the best time for it. But what do you think? Tell me how you feel. This is just something that I see on my end, but ultimately you're taking the wheel. So definitely not stopping at your recommendations and just kind of allowing the other person to talk about how they feel after they hear that information.
Thank you. Great answer. And here I'm going to make this our last question from Sigrid, asking, how do you interpret the gentle approach? Can you give an example?
Yeah, so for example, if going through a dietary recall, if there are specific ingredients that's high in FODMAP, so let's just say if someone's eating a lot of high FODMAP foods because they think it's in their culture it's healthy, they're eating it in large amounts after meals because that's typically per custom we always eat foods after meals in Asia. And so in those situations, if those are determined as the GI symptom triggers, then we can have that conversation about that instead of overhauling the entire diet and going on a low FODMAP diet. Maybe decreasing the portions of those fruits or substituting it with some of the low FODMAP fruits as part of that fruit mix, if you would, could already help them relieve their symptoms. So it depends on the amounts, and at this point, your clinical judgment on do I really need to do an overhaul to figure out the answer, or can I just kind of make little tweaks, suggest little tweaks, and see if that's enough to help improve things.
Great. Well, with that, I am going to wrap up our session. Thank you again, Yi Min, for sharing truly this wealth of knowledge. Really so helpful for all of us to hear and be able to learn from you. To everyone attending, as I mentioned, you'll receive a link to the recording to your CEU, and we'll include links to as many of these amazing resources as well so that you have those to reference going forward. And with that, thank you all again for attending. We'll see you.
So much. And thank you so much, Yi Min. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.